Just a quick review. Ruth is divided into 4 chapters that happens to be 4 acts that would make a wonderful play, actually, as it's designed. And in Act 1, it's entitled Death and Emptiness, because all the bad stuff happens in Act 1. That's when Elimelech and Naomi go to Moab because of a famine in Israel. Elimelech dies in Moab, and in the meantime, Naomi's 2 sons get married to Moabite women, and 10 years later, both of the sons die, which leaves Naomi with 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. And she says to them, it would be best for you just to stay here in the land of Moab. I'm going back home to Israel, to the town of Bethlehem. And Orpah says, you're right, Naomi, I'm just going to stay here. But Ruth refuses to leave. She's going to go with Naomi no matter where Naomi goes. And so the 2 of them go back to the land of Israel, to the town of Bethlehem. And the only good news in Act 1 is it's barley harvest season, which kind of leads us into Act 2. We now have 2 widows, an older widow, Naomi, a younger widow, Ruth. And in the ancient world, if you were a woman, you needed a man. You needed a husband to take care of you, to provide for you, and to protect you. And basically, the men in the ancient world are the ones who had the jobs. And so here are 2 widow women looking at each other going, we have no money, we have no food, what are we going to do? And Ruth says, I'm going to go out and glean in the fields, because it was legal for them to go glean in the fields, and the field owner was supposed to allow widows to do that, and even those who were not Israelites, a Moabite, to do that. And so Ruth had pledged to Naomi, I'm going to take care of you. So she goes to work in support of Naomi. She goes to a field that's owned by a man named Boaz. And Boaz hears through rumor. Bethlehem, the Christmas song, O Little Town of Bethlehem, it's always been a little town. So gossip spreads really quickly. So everybody in Bethlehem has heard about Ruth's story, including Boaz, and he's very kind to her. And he gives her all of these special privileges when it comes to gleaning. And so she's able in one day to glean enough food that would probably last for a couple of months. And she goes home to Naomi, and Naomi is kind of blown away. Because up to this point, Naomi is depressed. In fact, Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. So she's a bitter woman. She's angry at God. She's angry at life. But when she sees all the food, she kind of gets excited. This is going to be great. I'm not going to starve to death. I am going to survive. And that's the short-term security. They're going to be taken care of. They're not going to die. And then Act 2 ends with the statement that Ruth is living with her mother-in-law. And, okay, that's okay, but it's not the best. It would be best if Ruth was living with her husband, if she had one, which leads us to Act 3, and that's the search for permanent security. So Naomi, at the beginning of this act, which, by the way, there's 3 scenes, and the first scene, again, is a conversation between Naomi and Ruth. And Naomi looks at Ruth and says, you need a husband. In fact, you've come here from the land of Moab. Your mom and dad are back in Moab. All of your friends are back in Moab. The only person you really have here in the land of Israel is me, your mother-in-law. So I'm going to try to find you a husband. And so there's this plan. And then in verses 6 through 15, which we'll wrap up tonight, there's this private encounter that takes place between Ruth and Boaz. And then finally, Ruth's going to come home and tell Naomi everything that happened the night before. Because scene 3 takes place from the evening of one day until the morning of the next day. So it's kind of like a half a day or 3/4 of a day. And there are 3 things that happen. And the first is Naomi has a plan. And it's a crazy plan. She tells Ruth to put on perfume, take a bath, put on perfume, put on your very best clothes. Then I want you to go down to the threshing floor. This was the final stage of harvesting. And this is where they would separate the grain from the chaff. And it took place on a threshing floor specifically designed to make that happen. And once that happens, the grain is there. And once the grain's there, it can then be sold. So because the grain is there, and because there could be thieves or animals who could come and want to eat the grain, the men would stay there all night and guard the grain. That way nobody steals it, wild animals don't eat it. So also important in this whole thing is the town was located on a hill, and as soon as nightfall came, they would lock the gate of the town. And they did that for security purposes. If somebody wanted to attack them, they couldn't get in overnight. And then at daybreak, they would open the gate again. So what Naomi wants Ruth to do is, after she gets as beautiful as she can make herself be, she's to go out of the town before they close the gate, which means she can't get back in until the next morning. Then she's to sneak down to the threshing floor. And the only people in the threshing floor are men. And they're there working together, they're harvesting, then they'll have a great meal together, then they'll sleep probably in like a tent overnight and wake up the next morning and repeat the process. So she's going to sneak down to the threshing floor. And she has to find Boaz. And she has to keep an eye on him because she has to know which tent he's sleeping in. And that's important because once Boaz goes into his tent and falls asleep, she's supposed to sneak into his tent, uncover his feet and part of his legs, thinking that when nightfall comes, the cool breezes of the night will wake him up. And then Naomi says, when he wakes up, he'll tell you what to do. That's the plan. Now, if I was a woman, I would not go for that plan. But Ruth surprisingly says to Naomi, I'll do it exactly as you tell me to do it. And she does. So then there's this encounter between Ruth and Boaz. And she does. She sneaks down. She finds Boaz. And luckily for her, his tent is towards the end of where the grain pile is kept. So perhaps it's private, because everybody who works for Boaz is probably his servant. So he probably has his own little tent and his own little quarters there, which made it easier for her to sneak in, keep an eye on him, so that nobody sees her. Because if somebody sees her going into the tent owned by Boaz, they're probably going to think she's a prostitute. And that's not going to go over very well, especially with what we're going to learn this evening. So she goes into his tent, she uncovers his feet, she falls asleep at his feet, and then in verse 9, and this is kind of like the key to the story, Boaz wakes up. And perhaps because of her perfume, he can tell, there's a woman in my tent. And he asks, who are you? Because it's dark. I mean, this is the ancient world. There's not lights out there. Who are you? And she says, I am your servant, Ruth. And they know each other. So when she says Ruth, he knows exactly who she is. And then she makes this really strange statement. It's a request. Spread the corner of your garment over me. And, as we read this as modern people, we're thinking, okay, she must be cold too, so she wants a blanket. But that's not what that phrase means. So by spreading the corner of the garment over her, that's a marriage proposal. So here we have in the ancient world a woman proposing marriage to a man, which that was unheard of. Most marriages in the ancient world were arranged by parents. And if it wasn't arranged by parents, it was up to the man to find his wife. But here is a woman proposing to a man. Now, Naomi said to Ruth, when Boaz wakes up, he'll tell you what to do. But it appears as if Ruth decided, when he wakes up, I'm going to tell him what to do. I'm your servant, Ruth, and I want you to marry me. And then she explains why she's making the request. You are a guardian redeemer of our family. Now, back in the ancient world, if someone were to pass away, and there was a possibility that the family line could go away because of that, somebody could go in and redeem that. There was property that Elimelech owned that needed to be redeemed. And if you marry Ruth, those children would be considered part of Elimelech's line. Ruth was married to Mahlon, so those would in essence be his children who would carry on the family name, because that's how it worked in the ancient world. Now, normally, a guardian redeemer was not required to marry anyone. But in this case, Naomi's already decided she's too old to get married again, so that's out. So in order to continue the family line, the guardian redeemer would have to marry Ruth. And that's what she wants him to do. So basically she says to Boaz, you're the guardian redeemer, at least one of them, and I want you to do your duty and marry me and carry on the family line. Very risky thing to ask. Almost unheard of in the ancient world. So how does Boaz deal with all of this? And that's verse 10. He says, the Lord bless you, my daughter. So he perceives her as someone who's a woman of great quality, great character. He asks God to bless her. He calls her my daughter because he's significantly older than she is. If Ruth is in her 30s, Boaz is probably in his 50s. So he's an older man. He may himself be a widower. We're really not told, but that's a possibility. And that's why he calls her my daughter. It was also a term of affection. Because after, once you propose to somebody, you kind of just hold your breath until they say yes, It's like, oh, she said yes, I can breathe again. And I'm sure that, Ruth is kind of holding her breath. What is he going to say? And when he says, my daughter, that means, okay, he's going to be kind to me. So then he goes on to say, this kindness is greater than what you showed earlier. And probably what that means is, earlier, Ruth left everything to take care of Naomi. And by marrying Boaz, because he's a guardian redeemer, Naomi's going to have that family line of her husband Elimelech extended. And the property is going to be redeemed. And so not only is Ruth looking out for herself, she's continuing to look out for her mother-in-law. Because, as Boaz pointed out, you could have gone after a younger man. And if Ruth would have married a man who was not a guardian redeemer, it would have worked out fine for Ruth, but Naomi and the family line would have died. She would have been part of a different family line. So by marrying the guardian redeemer, Naomi's family continues as well. And that's where we left off last week. He continues with more instructions to her, which after the marriage proposal, Boaz does tell her what to do next, so Naomi was right about that. We're just not sure where the marriage proposal came from, if that was Ruth's idea or Naomi's idea. And so Boaz says, and now, my daughter, don't be afraid. And again, by calling her my daughter, he's being kind to her, affectionate towards her. Then he says, don't be afraid. Have you ever noticed that when an angel shows up to somebody in the Bible, the first thing they say is, don't be afraid? And at that point, the person should just raise their hand and say, too late. I just saw an angel. I'm scared to death. We could probably translate that, stop being afraid. Because you can imagine this Moabite woman sneaking into a man's tent. In the middle of the night, she proposes. That's risky. That's fearful. And maybe her voice was quivering a little bit, trying to get the words out. This is putting it all on the line. What if this goes wrong? This could be a disaster for her. What if Boaz would have said, Ruth, I only marry Israelite women. Sorry, Ruth. Or, no, Ruth, I was married once and I'm done with that, I'm just going to spend the rest of my days out in the field hanging out with the guys. I'm good. Don't want to get married again. Don't want children at this age, He could have said a lot of things. So she was afraid, and who could blame her? I mean, as I looked at the instructions, it's like, I'm too afraid to even attempt this. She did have the courage to at least go for it, and she did. And then Boaz says, I will do for you all you ask. Wow. Yeah, those are the magic words. Yes, Ruth, I could be your guardian redeemer. I could marry you. And it's interesting that those same words or something similar is what Ruth said to Naomi back in verse 5, where she says, I will do whatever you ask. Same type of thing. And by having both Ruth and Boaz say those similar words, it says something about their character. That they both are generous people, loyal people, almost like they were made for each other, that they would make a wonderful couple. Could they get together? And now Boaz is saying, I can do that. I'm willing to do whatever you say. Which I'm sure that was not what he was normally used to. I mean, Boaz is the rich landowner. He gives the orders. And people say, yes, sir. Now, he's got this young Moabite woman asking him to do something, and he's agreeing, I'll do whatever you say. That was kind of a role reversal for Boaz. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. And I think all along we've been asking and at least wondering, what did the people of Bethlehem think about Ruth? Because she is a Moabite, she's not an Israelite. Did they talk behind her back? Were they mean to her? Was it difficult for her to walk through town? What would people say about her? And it's interesting also that in the Hebrew, it literally says, all the gate of my people. So instead of all the people of the town, it's all the gate of my people. And part of that was the gate referred to the town gate, which was locked at night and opened in the morning. But it was also the town square. And in the ancient world, in the town square, that's where legal business, political business was conducted every day. So if you were to buy something, you would go to the town square. If there was a legal dispute that you had with somebody, you would take it to the court there. And it was out in the open so that everybody could hear and see everything that was going on. So what Boaz is really saying is all the elders and leaders, the bigwigs of this community, consider you a woman of noble character. What you did for Naomi was just incredible. And they knew that every day Ruth got up and went out and gleaned and got food for her and Naomi. That this Moabite woman would do that for her Israelite mother-in-law made an impression on the leaders of this town. And so it's also possible that Boaz was one of those elders who sat at the gate. He's a rich landowner. He's very well respected. He may have helped out as well as trying to solve cases, being a judge of these types of issues. So Boaz says, all the people in the town consider you a virtuous woman of noble character. Now, it's interesting that in our Bible, in our English Bibles, it's Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel. And Ruth is right after Judges because this story takes place during the same time that the judges were ruling over Israel. But in the Hebrew Bible, they organized it differently. It was law, prophets, and writings. And Ruth was considered a writing. And the book of Ruth often in the Hebrew Bible came after the book of Proverbs, which was interesting in this sense. Proverbs chapter 31, which is the last proverb, is about the virtuous woman, the ideal ancient woman. And it was almost as if you could read Proverbs 31 and hear about this woman, and then read the book of Ruth, and you could get an example of what this looked like in real life. So it was a great place to put the book of Ruth. So some of the characteristics that she had were the same as the characteristics of the virtuous woman. So it's also, in the NIV translation, a woman of noble character. That's how the NIV translates it. In Ruth chapter 2, verse 1, Boaz is described. And in the NIV, it calls him a man of standing. But it's the same Hebrew word. It's just translated different by the NIV. And both of it refers to virtuous character. So Boaz is a man of virtuous character. Ruth is a woman of virtuous character. They are the perfect match for one another. That's what the author is trying to communicate. So this virtuous man, this virtuous woman may just so happen to get married. But there's a problem. Don't you hate that? You know, when somebody's explaining something, you ask somebody to do something, and, they say, oh, yeah, I can do that, but. Or, this is going on, and it's really great, but. It's like, well, there's a but in this story. It's in verse 12. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Now we know why Boaz just didn't say, absolutely, Ruth, I'll marry you. Because there's this obstacle. And the obstacle is there's another guardian redeemer, which according to Israelite law in Leviticus chapter 25, the right to redeem goes to the closest male relative. Now, it's interesting that we do know that Boaz is related to Elimelech in some way, but it never tells us how they're related. And then there's this other person who's never named in the story, who is a nearer relative, and he has the right to say yes or no. So Boaz can't just ignore the law, especially if he's an elder and a judge in the town. You just can't throw out the law because it's going to suit you. So there's somebody else who is going to have to say yes or no to doing three things. One is to redeem the property, make sure it stays in the clan, in the tribe. Somebody's going to have to marry Ruth, and somebody, when they have children, they're going to be in the line of Elimelech and Mahlon. So somebody else is going to have to be willing to do that. And Boaz is apparently second in line. So he can't say anything yet until this other person hears about this and makes their decision. Which kind of raises the question, because Naomi knows about this other person. In fact, when Naomi finds out that Ruth's been gleaning in the field of Boaz, she says, oh, Boaz, he's a guardian redeemer. He's a near relative, but he's a near relative. He's a guardian redeemer. And Naomi knows somebody is more closely related, which raises the question, why isn't Naomi talking to that person? Because there's no indication she ever does. But we do know, perhaps, why she chose Boaz. I mean, Boaz is a man of great character. There's really nobody in Bethlehem who has anything bad to say about Boaz. Boaz has been extremely kind to Ruth and to Naomi. He's been very generous. Ruth knows him, and maybe she's attracted to him, don't know. So that's why Boaz gets chosen. But there's somebody else who has the first right of refusal. So now there's tension in the story again. That there's this other guy who could end up being Ruth's husband. It goes on to say in verse 13, Boaz is again speaking to Ruth, stay here for the night. And then it's interesting at the last of the verse, he says, lie here until morning. So both the front and the end of the verse basically say the same thing. Well, Boaz knows. The gate to the town is locked. I mean, this is about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning by now. And what's Ruth going to do? She can't go back to town. Gate's locked. So she's going to stay there. If he sends her away, bad things could happen to her. I mean, somebody could find her and physically harm her. If anybody finds a woman around the threshing floor, the assumption is she's a prostitute. So that's fair game. So he says to Ruth, you just have to stay here for the night. You have to stay in my tent for the night. In many ways, he's protecting her reputation. He's already said she's a woman of virtuous character. So the last thing he wants anybody to see her, roaming around the threshing floor and mistake her for a prostitute, and there goes her reputation. Also, he really can't take too much of a chance of somebody finding a woman in his tent, because he's a man of virtuous character. So they're just going to take this chance and lay low for the rest of the night. So she's going to stay there and be protected. Then he says, in the morning, if he, meaning the other guardian redeemer, wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. I wonder how sincere he was when he spoke those words. It may be that, there is another guardian redeemer and he has the first chance to redeem you. I'm really hoping he doesn't, but, I have to follow the law and he gets first rights to do this. So if he's going to redeem you, good. Bad for me, good for him. Let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Well, he finally says yes. There's an if clause, but he says yes. I'll redeem you, I'll marry you, I'll do everything that I need to do as a guardian redeemer if the other person says no. Which the other person does have the right to say no. And if he says no, it passes down to the next person, which would be Boaz. So what he's saying is absolutely true, but he's going to have to wait to let this person have the first shot at this. And then he says, lie here until morning. And the idea of lie here means go back to sleep until morning. The word lie can sometimes have a sexual connotation to it, but that's not what's going on here. I mean, Boaz has just made a commitment to Ruth to be the guardian redeemer, but I can't do it if the other person is going to marry you, so he's not going to violate her in that way. He just at this point wants to protect her by hiding her in his tent so that she can then hopefully sneak back to town in the morning so that nobody knows she's there. So basically go back to sleep. I wonder how much sleep they got that night. Probably not much. Boaz is thinking, tomorrow, I've got to go and I've got to find this guardian redeemer, and I know he knows who it is. I've got to go find this guy, I've got to talk to him, and I've got to present the case, and I've got to be honest and tell him everything and hope he says no. That way I can be the guardian redeemer. And, he's probably going, how do I want to word this? And how do I want to put this? And, wow, what if he says yes, he wants to be the guardian redeemer? It's like, wow. And what if he says no? And so it goes back and forth. And I'm sure he tossed and turned all night long. Ruth is now thinking, I'm getting married. But I don't know to whom. It could be to this guy that I don't even know his name, or it could be to Boaz. But I'm getting married one way or another. But before I can get married, I got to sneak out of here. I've got to leave early in the morning and hope that nobody sees me. And then I got to sneak back into town and go find Naomi and tell her everything. So a little anxiety there. What if I get caught? What if somebody sees me? So there's a little anxiety. And if you've ever had anxiety, it's tough to sleep when you have anxiety. So I'm guessing they tossed and turned most of the night. And then it's morning. She lay at his feet until morning, which means nothing happened between the two. So this turns out to be a Hallmark movie, not an R-rated movie. So she lays at his feet all night long. And at his feet, that's the position of a servant. She said, I'm your servant, Ruth. And so she's at his feet. As a wife, she would be by his side. But they're not married. She's still the servant. So she lays at his feet until morning. And then got up before anyone could be recognized. So before it gets too light, she awakes. And I'm sure she didn't sleep much anyways. And given the way people dressed in the ancient world, you could pull something over your face or cover most of your face and nobody could recognize you, especially if it's still mainly dark out. So she's got to wake up and not be recognized because Boaz says to her, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. Because if word gets around that Boaz and Ruth were together, well, that could ruin Ruth's reputation. It could also ruin the reputation of Boaz as well. So instead of being pillars of the community, they could be the social gossip of the community. And again, it's the little town of Bethlehem. It won't take long for word to spread through the community. It's also quite possible that Boaz, the landowner, knows that when the men go down to the threshing floor, they become targets of prostitutes. So Boaz may have said to the men, don't you dare let a woman into your tent. And the boss has spoken. But the boss just spent the night with the woman in his tent. And so the idea is no one must know that. If you're going to make the rule, you should follow it yourself. So Boaz's reputation with his men is on the line as well. So nobody must know what's going on. Their reputation could be severely damaged if somebody finds out. Well, Boaz goes on to say, bring me the shawl you are wearing. And it's interesting that this word translated shawl is only found in the Old Testament in one other place, and that is Isaiah chapter 3, verse 22. And it's one of the fine garments that a woman might wear. Now, Naomi told Ruth, dress in your best clothes. And apparently she did. And they were doing well while they were in Moab. So she may have had some really nice clothes that she brought from Moab to the land of Israel. And this shawl may have been a very nice piece of clothing. And so she was wearing it, of course, because she knows it's going to get cold at night. And this would help keep her warm. It's kind of interesting that people have certain characteristics based upon who they are. It's like, if you're a child and you go to grandma's house, you always come home with candy. Because before you leave, grandma's going to give you some candy to take home. Well, if you hang out with Boaz, you're going to end up with some barley. You're going to end up with some grain because he's got a lot of it. And so the next command is, bring me the shawl. And when she did, he poured into it 6 measures of barley. So she's going to go home with some more food. And it says 6 measures. In the Greek, the Hebrew rather, it says 6 barleys. But it doesn't say what he used to measure it with. So did he just reach into his pile of grain and get 6 handfuls and put it into the shawl? Did he have some kind of measuring device and he poured it out and dumped it in? We really don't know. They're estimating somewhere between 18 to 29 pounds of grain, which would have been a lot. And so it's all wrapped up in this shawl. And then Ruth is going to wrap it perhaps around her and carry the food home. And that raises the question. Gleaning season's over. This is the last of the harvest. Does Ruth really need more barley? Because first day of gleaning took home enough for 2 months. Doesn't she have enough barley and at this time wheat as well to basically last until the next harvest season? And the answer is probably yes. So why is he giving her barley and wrapping it in a shawl? Well, she's going to wear this thing. And if somebody sees her, they may or may not know who she is. There's this woman, and she's got this shawl wrapped up in grain. Oh, I think I know what happened. She's a poor woman. And she would be embarrassed to go during the daytime to get food because somebody may say something about her. So she did it at night so that nobody would know. That way she would not be embarrassed and have to admit that she was poor. So in many ways, by giving her this grain and wrapping it in a shawl, he's protecting Ruth in case she gets spotted by somebody. Just in case somebody sees her. They would not, see a woman carrying all this grain. They would not think, she's a prostitute. They would think she's a poor woman who was embarrassed and wanted to come at night or early in the morning to get the grain. So that was, in many ways, again, he's protecting her from possible rumors that could get started. Then it says, after he does this, he went back to town. So Boaz is going to leave. By now, I'm sure the sun has come up. He no longer has to guard the pile of grain. He's got servants there to do that. People will be coming to work in the morning to take care of things, and so he doesn't always have to be there. So he goes back to town. And we're not sure exactly where he went. Maybe he went back home because he didn't get much sleep, and he's going to try to catch up on his sleep. Or maybe he goes directly to the town square. And once they're open for business, he needs to find the guardian redeemer and have a conversation with him. And then eventually he's going to have to take that to the town square so that he could become the guardian redeemer if the other refuses to do so. So that's a good possibility as well. Now, in some of the text, it doesn't say he went back to town. It says she went back to town. And it's always interesting when, in the ancient world, if you wanted to copy the book of Ruth, you had to copy it by hand, letter by letter. Back in the ancient world, they didn't have a wonderful copy machine like we have, where you just, slide it through. And in less than 2 minutes, I had, copies for everybody tonight of the lesson. It was a piece of cake. But back then, you had to copy it word for word. And some of the copyists, if they think the author made a mistake, they may try to correct the mistake. So, as somebody's copying this, he went back to town. This is verse 15. Verse 16 is about Ruth and Naomi. So wouldn't it make more sense if she went back to town? Because the next verse is about Ruth. It's about a she. So chances are somebody changed he to a she, which means he was probably the original. So the author's letting us know he went back to town, and that kind of creates the suspense. We know where Ruth's going. She's going to go back and tell Naomi everything that happened the night before. But he's going to go back to town, and he's got to have a conversation with the nearer guardian redeemer. So that's the suspense that builds. So it's interesting that we can say it really doesn't make any difference because it's he or she, because they both went back into town, but not together. And that was the key part. Nobody could see the two of them together. They had to go separately so that this whole thing would all work out. What an incredible plan. What an incredible way in which, it's kind of interesting that God's really not mentioned in this story. But we do know that Boaz is a worshiper of God. He's a very godly man. We also know that Ruth is a woman of great character, and probably when she came to the land of Israel, learned about the God of Israel and is now following the God of Israel. Even though God's not mentioned, we kind of see his hand in working all of this out. Because apparently Ruth is able to sneak into the threshing floor and nobody sees her. And then she's able to sneak out and nobody sees her and nobody raises a question. God was part of that plan. And it doesn't say that Naomi prayed before she created this wild and crazy plan, but maybe she did. Because God certainly answered the prayer. Which lets us know that even though we can't always see God's hand, he's up to something. He's working in our lives. He knows what's around the corner. He knows what we need to be thinking and what we need to be doing. God is in control, and God wants to lead us and guide us. And sometimes we recognize that, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we recognize it 5 years down the road. As we retell our story, God just kind of worked that out. I didn't even know it at the time. But God kind of worked out all of those circumstances the way he wanted them to come together. And Naomi, in going from depression and being angry at God, all the way back in chapter 1, is beginning to see that God can work through all of this. And sometimes when life is hard, we blame God, we get angry at God, but we have to trust him long enough for his plan to come together. And sometimes that means waiting, praying before it all comes together. But God had a plan from the get-go. And God knew exactly what he wanted to do. But when we're in the middle of it, it's hard to figure it out sometimes. But when we look back on it, we can go, oh, that's what God was doing. That's what God was trying to teach me. I've got it now. So that's what's happening in this story. And even though God isn't mentioned very often in this story, as the story is told, we can see his hand working behind the scenes, just as he's working out your life behind the scenes. He's not always front and center, but he's got a plan, and he is working out the details. Well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this most incredible story. And Father, it's a reminder for all of us that you have a plan and a purpose for our life, that you're working out the details, that you're doing things in our lives. You are answering our prayer, but sometimes it takes a while for everything to come together. Sometimes things don't go our way, and we have to work through that because you have a different plan, a better plan for us. So, Father, help us to just be people of faith, believing that you're doing something even though we may not understand it. So, Father, help us increase our faith. May this story build up our faith in you, that even when things fall apart, you're there. Even when things don't go our way, you're still there. And you have a way of putting things back together that's absolutely incredible. So, Father, increase our faith, grow our faith in you. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.